listening to the Lead Like No Other podcast, episode 87. On today's episode, we're going to talk about emotional intelligence and really the origins behind it, why it works. And this will be a series of workshops because then what we'll do is we'll break down each one of the behaviors that helps to develop emotionally intelligent responses. And I think that is so important in the environment that we're living in today. If you didn't think emotional intelligence was something that was relevant or important, my guess is, or my hope is, that your outlook on this has changed. Because if you live in the world that most of us are living in now, that it is filled with anxiety and fear, frustration and anger. And unless we find ways to manage that either in ourselves or also in our ability to help others, we're going to be in very difficult situations as we start to re-enter with some type of normalcy. This is not a nice to have skill. It's a need to have skill going forward. And there's a lot of research that demonstrates why it's important. As you know, this is the Lead Like No Other podcast, where I'm not only obsessed with interviewing those whose actions are inspiring others to do great things, but also in uncovering the research that demonstrates that we all have the ability to lead like no other and to rise above our best. And it starts with ourselves. So let's get into it. As I mentioned, this podcast will be the first in a series that will really explore, take a deep dive into emotional intelligence. And really what I want to do today is just set the stage for why emotional intelligence is important. So we'll explore what is emotional intelligence, or EQ, emotional quotient. Why is it important? I think another thing that's important to look at is, can it be improved? Can I improve my emotional intelligence? We'll look at some research there, as well as what does the research overall tell us about EI. The goal here is through this series of podcasts to help you identify the skills that you can use, whether at home or at work. Understand how the skills improve your effectiveness. That's really it. And then when you finish listening to these podcasts, you'll be able to have some tangible or actionable items that you can walk away with, and you can start to develop this muscle yourself. So again, when we first talk about it and say, well, what is emotional intelligence or emotional quotient? It's our ability to perceive, understand, and manage both our emotions and the emotions of those around us. And really what it looks at to me in the work that I've been involved with is there's a connection between our emotions and how we behave, how we make decisions, and how we perform. That's, I think, the simplest way that we can look at this. That if we think about it this way, that my emotion, if I'm angry, how I behave, the decisions I might make, and how I perform in that situation, or if I'm anxious or frustrated or scared or stressed, versus if I am in a positive place of feeling confident, happy, whatever that might be, how I am in each of those sections is going to be different. I'm going to perform differently if I'm confident versus if I'm scared. I'm going to make different decisions as well. The important thing here is to know that EI, it can be developed, but it takes work and it takes time. But it's well worth that. And as I said, this is not really a nice to have, it's a need to have. When we first looked at emotional intelligence, the belief is that it was conceptualized in around 1990 by two researchers, one named Peter Salovey and the other was Jack Mayer. And what's interesting here is in 1998, Harvard Business Review, they had an article on emotional intelligence, and it was the most requested reprint in 40 years, which I find fascinating that we have a business journal that the most highly requested article is on emotional intelligence. To me, that speaks volumes about the piece that has been missing organizationally for decades, is leaders and individuals understanding the impact and importance of developing emotionally intelligent behaviors. It's not to say that it's the panacea, but it certainly is not a soft skill. Developing emotionally intelligent behaviors is the strongest skill I believe that you can develop or refine, because it has so many different aspects, so many different areas that it benefits an individual and an organization. Now, in 2002, Daniel Goleman had a book that he had written in 1995 that it became the most widely read social science book in the world. And what we also find is that emotional intelligence is increasingly being used throughout the armed services. It's also being added to business schools as part of their curriculum. It's being added to medical schools as part of their curriculum. It has wide reaching impact. When we think about emotions, they play such a large role in our outward displays and our emotions. They help define really our tone of voice that we might use. Are we sarcastic? Are we angry? Our body language. Are we folding our arms? Are we tapping our fingers? And things like our facial expressions, smirks, rolling eyes. What are we doing with our body? How do we control those things, or how do we read those things in other people? And that's part of this perception of understanding where other people are. You might be thinking, well, why is it important to improve emotional intelligence? And there are numerous studies in a number of different areas. A couple that I'll mention. One is work that's been looked at in terms of improved work group effectiveness, its ability to reduce stress, burnout, certainly, and we see this a lot in healthcare, that it can be very beneficial there. Increased job satisfaction and employee engagement. There's a lot of research. One article that I was reading yesterday, that was a study that looked at those that had higher levels of emotionally intelligent behaviors tended to rate themselves, their jobs, as being more satisfied in the roles that they were in. It also has a benefit in terms of increased customer satisfaction, also increased sales revenue. I know my background was in biotech sales for about 15 years. And as I look back on my success in that area and the connections that I made, I believe that it was a direct result of my ability to develop emotionally intelligent behaviors. Reading and understanding the situations that I was in helped me to not mislead people or take advantage of people, but really understand the connection there of what was important. Lastly, we know with EI, we've seen it in terms of reduced litigation. There's some research that I will often cite that, and I believe it was called the Apology Project, but this was something that was done within hospital settings where they actually had an initiative and they followed it, where they had hospitals that would proactively, if a mistake was made with a patient, would approach them basically taking responsibility for what happened. What they found, though, was that in those instances where that happened, that litigation costs actually were reduced. Now, it doesn't say that they were eliminated, but they were reduced. And again, I think that speaks to emotionally intelligent behaviors in terms of empathy. How would I want to be treated? Would I want somebody just to take responsibility if they made a mistake? If they're doing that, I'm less likely to want to find ways for retribution on that or damages. Not to say that there don't need to be in many cases, but if I feel like somebody's taking responsibility for their actions, I'm more forgiving toward that person. And the reason being is because we all make mistakes. We're humans. Can we improve this, though, in terms of EI? I would compare this to a muscle. That's all we're doing, is developing a muscle. Now, when I do this work within organizations, I will often talk about setting goals. And many might have heard of SMART goals. I don't tend to use SMART goals. I find there's an easier process to use, which I call set goals: specific, emotional, and time bound. And when we talk about developing a new set of behaviors, that's really what we're doing. Specifically, what do I want to do here? Emotionally is, why do I want this? Why is it important for me to develop these skills? And then time bound. When am I going to complete a course by, or when am I going to do this by? But also with time bound, it could be, how often am I going to practice during the week? That maybe it's 3 days a week. I'm really going to take a close look at what I'm doing and evaluating this. It's important to do that. A couple other things that I think are important as we talk about improving EI is, one, this is about incremental change. Small changes make big differences long term, and that's what we have to look at. I think too often we get caught up today in, we need immediate change. I need to see results immediately, and that's not the way this generally works. But in the long run, you will see benefit if you do this incrementally, just a little bit at a time. For us to be able to do this, and we'll talk about it further in one of the actual episodes, is around intentional vulnerability. To be effective as a leader and in developing emotionally intelligent behaviors, you need to become intentionally vulnerable. And what I mean by that is, we need to be in a place where we can say, I'm wrong, I don't have the answer, maybe I'm struggling, I'm sorry, Those are things that when we demonstrate those, when we're able to say those things as leaders, especially, as long as I'm not doing this every single day, right? That doesn't build confidence in the other person or trust. I want to know if there's somebody that I am following that they have this ability in them to be able to admit when they're wrong or they're sorry, because I know that if they're able to do that, if they have that capacity, I'm going to trust that person more. And I'm more open to following where they want to go because I know that they're not just going to be full of fluff and not be transparent. They're able to do that. So important. When we talk about emotionally intelligent in a workplace setting, one of the things that I will often reference is work done around employee disengagement. And there's a couple surveys that I've referenced quite often. One, a Gallup data survey, and I will often show one that is dated based on quarters from the year 2010. And I will jokingly say that, somebody that's looking at my slides might be thinking, geez, Patrick, you might want to update your slides. And actually, what I'm doing is demonstrating to them that in a decade, the numbers around engagement versus disengagement within an organization have barely changed at all. That you find that about 2/3 of an organization, employees are disengaged. And of those, in some of the work done by Gallup, they would suggest that 15 to 19% of those individuals are actively disengaged, which is really more damaging because that's a contagion where not only am I unhappy here, but I'm going to let everybody else know how unhappy I am. So when we look in terms of some of the work done by Gallup, what's the impact of this? So what? You've got some employees that are disengaged. Well, when they've teased out this information and looked at the top 25th percentile versus the bottom 25th percentile, they've seen really large gaps in terms of things like absenteeism, turnover rates, theft within organizations, safety incidences, patient safety incidences. A lot of the work that I am involved with from time to time is in healthcare. I think most would agree with that. And there's so much data around that. Some of the manufacturing groups that I work with, when we look at quality defects, we can see that based on Gallup's work, that there was a huge difference in terms of engaged versus disengaged organizations as it related to quality defects and what their products were. And what's interesting is that this data is all based on what is called the Q12. So there were 12 survey questions that Gallup asks employees. And what's interesting about these questions is that out of the 12, 11 of them really are directly or can be directly related to the manager or the person that person reports to. And I'll quickly go through them. One is, do you know what is expected of you at work? Next is, do you have the materials and equipment you need to do your work right? The next is, in the last year, have you had the opportunity at work to learn and grow? Next is, at work, do you have the opportunity to do what you do best every day? The next is, in the last 7 days, have you received recognition or praise for doing good work? Next, does your supervisor or someone at work seem to care about you as a person? Next, is there someone at work who encourages your development? Next, at work, do your opinions seem to count? Next is, does the mission purpose of your company make you feel your job is important? Next is, are your associates, fellow employees committed to doing quality work? The next is, do you have a best friend at work? And then lastly, in the last 6 months, has someone at work talked to you about your progress? So out of all 12 of those, the only one that really is not about or can relate to the manager or that person that I report to is, are your associates, fellow employees committed to doing quality work? And I would argue that even that one, it's simply a contagion that they may or may not report to somebody that creates that feeling in them. So it's an indirect response to that one. And what's so important here is that we know, again, through much of the research that says that the number one reason somebody leaves an organization is because of who they report to directly. So there's so much influence that the person has that if I'm in the position of leadership here, or I hold the authority based on my title, I have a huge responsibility to whether there's engagement or disengagement from the standpoint of the environment that is created for that to happen. And I bring that up specifically is to say that you could have people that say, well, I can't create or make somebody happy or unhappy. That's their decision. And I would agree that you can have people that I could do everything for them and maybe they just choose to not want to be happy. I don't control that. But what I do as a leader need to provide is the environment where engagement can take hold. And that's really what these questions address. So when we look at some of the research, I'm just going to mention a few here that I think are important as we go through. Is one I will reference often is called the contagious leader. And it is the impact of the leader's mood on the mood of the group members. This was a study that was done. It was looking at investigating how a leader's mood affects the mood of the individual group members, the effect on the group as a whole, and then 3 group processes were also looked at: coordination, effort expenditure, and task strategy. And there were 189 participants in this study. The groups were blinded, so they didn't know what was going on, and the leaders were induced into either a positive or a negative mood. And what they found was at the end of this, when they looked back in terms of the leaders, that there was a mood contagion that was experienced, and it followed. A positive mood contagion created a positive mood environment. A negative mood created a negative mood environment. And this was in the Journal of Applied Psychology, is where this was published back in 2005. And I think this is so important to talk about how important our role is in creating an environment, a contagious, positive environment. And that really comes through our ability to develop strong, emotionally intelligent behaviors. The next one looked at the relationship between emotional intelligence on job performance. And this was a meta analysis. This was a large meta analysis that identified about 1,100 different citations that were relevant to emotional intelligence, as well as the 5-factor model of personalities, which is often referenced, as well as around cognitive abilities and job performance. They ended up using 43 studies and analyzing those. And what they found was, in regards to emotional intelligence, all 3 streams of emotional intelligence they looked at correlated with job performance. And the present data that they looked at all strongly supported the predictive ability of emotional intelligence in terms of job performance. And really, it was above and beyond what they were able to predict, whether it was using the 5-factor model of personality or an individual's cognitive ability. And this was in the Journal of Organizational Behavior back in May 2010. And I think that is so important to look at this to say this was a large meta-analysis. And what they found, again, was that EI was able to predict job performance above and beyond what some of the other tools that we might think of or areas that we might look at were being evaluated. More than personality, more than somebody's cognitive ability. Next is a piece of research that looked at emotional intelligence and empathy. And this was actually a study that was done with the fMRI, where patients were actually monitored through magnetic resonance imaging. There were 17 participants. They were shown images of patients that were in pain. And then they were asked to imagine that they themselves were in pain. Not that they were just observing a patient in pain, but that they were the ones experiencing the pain. What they found was that higher responses to images were seen when they were using imagination than when they actually viewed patients in pain. So that part of the person's brain that experiences pain was more active when they imagined it as opposed to just looking at somebody else. And what that demonstrates to us is our ability for empathy, it's regulated by perspective taking. The important part here is, where does this play out in terms of how we interact with other people? That when we're able to really imagine what it's like to be where they are, one, we really start to feel, what they're feeling, and we need to keep that in a positive way, but it allows us to really develop a connection level of trust with somebody where I can truly try and see where somebody else is. So I would think back to some of my kids when they were going through those teenage years, and I have 2 that are going through it right now, is that it's easy for me to judge them or to hold them accountable to certain things, but not take the time to wonder, what was it like when I was 15? How was I behaving when I was 15? And is what I'm asking of them or expecting them to do, is it reasonable? And oftentimes I have to come back to, quite honestly, I was far worse, I think, at times in terms of some of my behaviors. That doesn't mean that everybody gets to do whatever they want. We still need to talk about clear expectations, but I need to be able to go to that place. If I want to be able to have, I think, open communication and build trust, then I need to be able to remember what it was like to be a 15-year-old boy. Next is around increasing emotional intelligence. Is it possible? This was a piece of research that was published in Personality Individual Differences back in 2009. And what they did was they had 37 participants. 19 were in a training group, 18 were in a control group, and they trained them in basically the theoretical models of emotional intelligence and how to employ certain skills in their daily lives. There were 4 sessions, 2.5 hours over 4 weeks, and they looked at 4 different areas: understanding, identifying, expressing, and managing emotions. What they found was the training group, but not the control group, scored significantly higher on trait emotional intelligence after the training. And more importantly, that they found the results were durable after 6 months. So 5 months after they finished this, those that went through the training, they found that the impact that it had on their emotional intelligence was durable. Now, I would suggest that probably after 4 weeks, those participants were seeing some benefits. They were seeing some results from what they were doing. So what they did was they realized that, hey, this is working. Let's keep it going. And that's what they did. That's why that's important. Not that they didn't do anything for the next 5 months, but it was durable because they saw results early on. And that's the benefit that we have. We get small incremental benefits that we just build off of those. And that's where emotional intelligence can become so valuable for us. So the model that we'll look to going forward, there are 7 skills that we'll dissect. One is around emotional self-awareness. We'll start out with that one. There'll be some exercises in there that we'll talk about. How do you develop this? We'll talk about emotional expression. We'll talk about awareness of others. How do you start to develop that? Emotional reasoning or buy-in. How do you gain agreement through emotional intelligence, through our emotionally intelligent behaviors? How do we manage our emotions? Self-management. How do we manage others? Will be another module. And then lastly, will be around emotional self-control. And we can see that we're in an environment right now that all of those things are valuable. Each one of those built upon the other one becomes a powerful model for us to manage ourselves as well as to manage those around us. And that really, to me, is when we talk about reimagining what leadership looks like, it's about inspiring, empowering, and compelling others to follow our lead. And this, to me, is foundational for that to happen. So with that said, I would encourage you to stick around for each one of these upcoming podcasts, because I promise you the activities and the ability to uncover why each of these are beneficial will be so valuable to you, whether it's at work or at home or in the community, wherever you are. Developing this set of behaviors or this set of skills will improve any and every aspect of your life. That I will say unquestionably. And I hope you've enjoyed this intro into emotional intelligence, that you've seen where there's actually quite a bit of research and evidence that backs up why this is important and how many different aspects of our lives can be impacted by our ability to develop these 7 behaviors that we'll talk about going forward. If you know somebody you believe might have interest in listening to these as well, I would ask that you forward this on to them. It would mean the world to me if you would leave a rating or a comment on this or any other episode that has been published. And until the next time we get together, I hope you're able to do 2 things. One is lead like no other, and the other is to rise above your best. Peace.